Hello and welcome. This is our next session on the topic of tithing. My name is Carlston Villa. I am the author of Reviewing Tithing in Context. And in our first session, we dealt with Abraham. Abraham tithed out of the king of Sodom's goods, which were spoils of war. And we found out in Jacob's case, Jacob tithed. Well, he gave a vow to tithe, but we're never actually sure if he actually did in the pre-law period, which we have no evidence of it. But also the tribe of Levi, which is the priestly tribe, were actually still in his loins. So effectively, he had no one to tithe to. Now, this is the pre-law period. In the last session, we dealt with the law and what the law actually required for the purpose of tithing. So tithing and the Mosaic law. And in this session, what we're going to deal with is how many tithes. Now, this is really, really important. We found out in the last session that tithing was food sources effectively only in the form of harvest or from flocks. So pre-law, you only have tithes in the form of spoils of war. And in the Mosaic law, you only have tithes in the form of food sources. Now, the question is, how many tithes are there? So if you're invoking the tithes as an eternal moral principle to be made applicable to the modern day church, which tithe is it you're asking for if you're a minister? And equally, which tithe are you paying if you are part of the congregation? Now, what's quite useful is we also have historians like Josephus, Tacitus, Suetonius, who were able to give us insight in the biblical period. And the existence of 3 tithes can also be confirmed by Flavius Josephus specifically. He was a Jewish historian from whom we glean a lot of historical reference during this time period. Josephus is often quoted to verify the historical accuracy of the Bible. So what does he specifically say in Antiquities regarding tithes? Josephus says, in addition to 2 tithes, which have already directed you to pay each year, the one for the Levites and the other for the banquets, you shall devote 1/3 of every 3rd year to the distribution of such things are lacking to widowed women and orphaned children. So he confirms that there are 3 tithes. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to explain what the 3 tithes were. The first tithe was the Levitical tithe to be collected once a year. I dealt with that in the last session, which was session 4 on tithing and the Mosaic law. And there was the second tithe, the festival tithe, to be collected once a year. And then, of course, there was the third tithe as well, the poor tithe, that was to be collected every 3 years. Now, the first tithe was the Levitical tithe. Sometimes people get confused between the priestly tithe and the Levitical tithe. They want to make 2 tithes out of them. But there wasn't a separate priestly tithe, there was separate Levitical tithes because the priests were also part of the tribe of Levi. So we need to remember that for the Levitical tithe, it happened effectively once a year, and all the food sources were given to them in the form of a 10th. So the Levites collected a 10th of the food sources. So a 10th of the 10th would go to the priests. The priests would have to eat them in the temple area. The Levites, or the temple workers, could take them home to their families and their Levitical cities. You could only tithe if you lived in the land of Israel and that the produce of the harvest was from the land of Israel, or the flocks were from the land of Israel. If you were a Hebrew and you lived outside of Israel, you couldn't tithe. And equally, if you were a stranger and you lived inside of Israel, you couldn't tithe either. So that was the Levitical tithe that I described in session 4. Now, then you move on to the second tithe, which is the festival tithe. The festival tithe was almost in the form of a family holiday. So depending on what festival was on, it could have been the actual Feast of Tabernacles, whereby they would all go to Jerusalem and they would celebrate with the Levites, and they would take their burnt offerings there. We have this written in Deuteronomy 12, 6-7. Now, if you choose to go with the argument they simply tithe food as there was no financial system, then the following scripture will let you know that money was readily available and used as a form of exchange, not just a bartering system. The only time it was acceptable to use money was for the festival tithe, and only if the meeting place was too far to travel, as food could spoil. It was a logistical issue. So In this festival tithe, the second tithe, we only ever have the mention of money. But here is the situation. You couldn't tithe the money. You could only buy food sources with the money and celebrate with the Levites there. And they would eat in the presence of the Lord. They would eat their tithe in the presence of the Lord, and they would celebrate in the presence of the Lord with the Levites. So, Deuteronomy 14:24-27 says, "But if the journey is too long for you, so that you're not able to carry the tithes, or if the place where the Lord your God chooses to put his name is too far from you, when the Lord your God has blessed you, then you shall exchange it for money. Take the money in your hand and go to the place which the Lord your God chooses. And you shall spend that money for whatever your heart desires, for oxen or sheep, for wine or similar drink. For whatever your heart desires, you shall eat there before the Lord your God. And you shall rejoice, you and your household. You shall not forsake the Levite who is within your gates, for he has no part nor inheritance with you." So this is the second tithe. So first tithe, Levitical tithe, and then you have the festival tithe, which is a tithe that I've just explained as well, which is also tithed in the form of harvest, flocks, and food, whereby they are all celebrating together. So those are the first two tithes. Now the third tithe is something called the triannual poor tithe. The triannual poor tithe did not happen once a year. It happened every 3 years. So the triannual poor tithe was, for whom the name actually suggested, it took place every 3 years. It wasn't just for the widow and orphans, it was also for the stranger who was not originally from Israel. Side note, strangers to Israel were not allowed to tithe, just a reminder. More on this another time. So this tithe went to the place it was needed in Israel and not specifically to the holy city. We have therefore 3 distinctly different tithes. Now the evidence for the triannual poor tithe is in Deuteronomy 14:28-29, and then also Deuteronomy 26:12-13. So we have bring the whole tithes, plural, in other words 3 tithes, into the storehouse. That is the request. And remember, it is a storehouse in the form of food. So if we think of these 3 tithes, if we have 2 tithes of 10% a year and 1 tithe of a tithe every 3 years, that equals to 23.3% recurring, not effectively 10%. So back to the question. If we are in church and if we are tithing, the question to answer is, and I'd like you to comment on this in the comment section or even ask a question, which tithe is it specifically you paying? Are you paying the Levitical tithe? Are you paying the festival tithe? Are you paying the triannual poor tithe? Because these 3 tithes together come to 23.3% every year, not 10%. So this is an important question. Please do comment in the comment section. Also, if we can get a discussion going on that'd be great. Any questions you have, ask in the comment section as well. Please like, also subscribe. And if you want to follow the book, the link to the book will be in the description. My name is Carsten Villa. I'm the author of Tithing, Reviewing Scripture in Context. Thank you so very much for listening, and I will see you in the next session. Thank you very much.